Bring it back from break here. Looks like some folks are taking a nice long break, but we have one more session before we wrap up sessions for the day and go to the business dinner tonight for members and prospective members. One last topic in our afternoon of repatriation sessions. Sheila Bird, friend of NATHPO and creator and host of THPO Talk, is going to give you a summary and debrief from the International Repatriation meeting that she hosted in the fall and run this session. And then our member, Stephen Concho, is also going to talk to us about the STOP Act and creation of that all the way across the finish line. So I'm going to hand it over to you all. Thank you.
Thank you again. My name is Sheila Bird, and I'm kind of glad Stephen's up here with me because both of us were posed with a question back in September of almost doing the, it was a topic that was very new to us. And some of the tribes that are in the room right now are some of the ones that I called and invited them to come to a meeting that is very important. It's more lighthearted, and I'm happy to share this information with you. But I'm going to let Stephen Concho, who is a Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Pueblo of Acoma, I'm going to let him come up and tell their story. And also he's going to touch on some of the STOP Act. And I wanted him to go first because I think the STOP Act that was recently passed is really important. And there's going to be some key points in there, I think, that we can bring into the whole discussion. So I think we should start with that, and then I'll finish up with our Oklahoma meeting. But let's welcome Stephen Concho.
Good evening or good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Stephen Concho, and I am the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Pueblo of Acoma in New Mexico. And it's very, very happy to be here, happy to be asked to tell you about our involvement, Acoma's involvement in the STOP Act. Now, what the STOP Act is, the Safeguarding Tribal Objects of Patrimony Act. And so I'm going to take you back. This took many years to accomplish. Back in 2015, it was because of a ceremonial shield that had been illegally removed from the Pueblo of Acoma. This was a shield that was used in ceremonies that our leadership became aware. And this shield happened to come up in an auction overseas and in Paris. And we got that information that this shield, along with other ceremonial objects from different tribes, were also being auctioned. But that shield was very particular. It had been removed from our place at Acoma in the early 70s. And to see this again in the auction place was very unique. And so our leadership at that time wanted to see if we can get that shield back. So our leadership, what they did is they pleaded with the auction house in Paris, and they didn't want to give the shield back to Acoma. I mean, of course, we begged, and our governor at that time, pleaded with the auction house. But lo and behold, they still kept that shield on the auction block. However, that year, the shield did not sell. So, which was good news. Later that next year in 2016, we found out that the shield was back up on the auction block again. And this time our leadership went to higher people, higher authority. They went to members of Congress. They went to different folks, just anybody who would listen. We tried to tell them to help us, help the Pueblo people, help Acoma, help all those other folks that had objects in that auction block. And so we're watching the auction go through. We're watching it live, as a matter of fact, our governor at that time. And all of a sudden, we found out that the shield was removed from the auction. And it was because of the hard work of our tribal officials at that time, our senators, congressmen, that shield was removed and eventually made its way back to Acoma. Many of our governors, our leadership were a part of this. Started off with our Governor Fred Weil, Governor Kurt Riley, Governor Brian Weil, and our current Governor Randall Vicente. And so it was very hard fought line that we had to, legislation that we had to pass. Acoma is very instrumental in drafting the provisions of this STOP Act. Now, what this STOP Act does, and it prohibits the export of NAGPRA, cultural items, and ARPA, Native American archaeological resources, when prohibits them from being trafficked domestically. So that's what the STOP Act does. It also confirms the authority of the president to enter into agreements under existing treaties with other countries to protect cultural heritage items. So with this STOP Act, there was a ceremony back in January, middle part of January, where Senator Heinrich, who was Martin Heinrich, or excuse me, Senator Martin Heinrich was the one that helped the Pueblo of Acoma push this bill through, and it was passed. And we had a huge ceremony in Albuquerque to celebrate the passage of the STOP Act. So this is just the beginning. There's, of course, it also strengthens the laws, strengthens penalties if somebody is caught, trying to sell sacred items. So this is just the beginning. And so we're very proud to be a part of this STOP Act. And, I hope it does help all of our tribal communities throughout the United States, because, our cultural items, especially those sacred items, really need to be in the possession of our homelands, need to come back home. So that's what I have to share with you. And so I can turn the mic back over. Thank you.
Well, we want to thank your tribe for your longstanding position on getting your shield back and following up with the STOP Act. We know it doesn't happen overnight. So thank you to your tribe for standing in that place for us. My approach with international repatriation is a little bit newer. I didn't become a THPO until 2015. And only recently had I became acquainted with international repatriation to a greater level. I've always known about NAGPRA, haven't we all? There's so much about it. But when I got involved in the middle of September to bring together a meeting in Oklahoma, it was the result of the White House Council on Native American Affairs. They have a subcommittee for international repatriation. I got involved to organize the meeting in Oklahoma in a short amount of time, really. We only had by the time we pinned down a date, we probably had 5 weeks to do it. And in Indian country, a lot of our conferences and our meetings are scheduled a year in advance. But some of you in here know that I called you. I started calling the people that I knew. One thing I wanted to do was contact the tribes that I knew had been involved in international repatriation, even if it was limited. While we're very familiar with domestic NAGPRA, international repatriation was another discussion. But some of the tribes did respond, and in short timing. So that sent a message, a clear message. There was 27 tribes that actually responded in a short amount of time. And if you are a tribe that came to our meeting in Oklahoma, I would like you to stand up. I think there's a few in here that have. Okay, I want to give you a hand. Because in talking to our preservation offices, you know, I think one of their first thoughts would be, what else? You know, we've got so many other projects taking place and going on. And now we want to talk about something else that would add to our plate. So it wasn't an easy discussion, because finding a tribe that has been successful with international repatriation was going to be the challenge. And the reason why I reached out to the Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate first is because I knew that they had. Out of the 27 tribes that came to Oklahoma for their visit, we had probably about 4 tribes that actually had experience or had fully went through the process. And so we had a lot of new learners in the room, whether you were a veteran THPO or brand new THPO. International repatriation isn't a really broad topic, and it's very narrow. The good thing about it is we don't have to work with any NATHPO regulations to do it. That was probably the plus. And that was hard to get across to our THPOs, though, is now we have an international barrier, or when we talk about the STOP Act, you know, we or challenges. But I do want to recognize the subcommittee members that are here today, and that I had these conversations early on when we started planning. And in that planning, it took finding a venue, and it involved finding a host tribe. But first, I want to recognize 2 of our visitors. 2 folks from the actual subcommittee that is with us here today, and they were at the meeting in Oklahoma, and they were very instrumental in the planning of this meeting. I asked them to come today, just in case there were any questions. I would like for the tribes to leave with more answers than questions, even though it's still new. And at the end of this discussion, I'll let you know how we plan to move forward with it beginning in March. Ashley Fry, would you stand up, Ashley? She's right here. She's the Indigenous Affairs Officer for the United States, for the State Department from the Cultural Heritage Center. She's also a member of the Choctaw Nation. So we enjoyed that Ashley took the time to be with us in Oklahoma and to make this trip here today. The other gentleman here is from the U.S. Department of Justice, Martin Earing. He's also an enrolled member of the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe. The federal agencies that were involved in the subcommittee was the Department of Justice, the Department of Interior, the State Department. There's some other folks that were involved as contributing. That's not a state agency, would be the NMAI, and we have their members here today. Jackie, your group, you guys, we saw them out in ATOM, and they also came to Oklahoma. So there was a lot of folks. IMLS are the only ones that don't have a representative here, but it took all these moving parts to bring this meeting together. The other thing that we needed was so critical to what we were trying to accomplish here, and that was to find a host tribe. That was challenging. I went to visit 5 before I found one that said, we want to be a part of this program. And it was the Otoe Missouri tribe out of Red Rock, Oklahoma. Their THPO is here, Miss Elsie Whitehorn. And so we will forever be in gratitude for her stepping up and really jumping some hurdles quickly. Because granted, remember, we only had 5 weeks to get this accomplished. But the goal was to bring as many tribes that we could bring to Oklahoma to start having these discussions. I don't think anybody had any idea how large the party was going to grow, because we, like I said, we had 27 tribes, but sometimes 2 and 3 representatives from each of them. We ended up with 75 people in Oklahoma having this discussion. But along with them, they brought some of these international museums with them from Berlin, from the University of Oxford, Finland, and New Zealand. Those representatives came to the United States to have a discussion with the tribes. So it was important to me to get as many voices to the table. And that was the angle that I was taking on pulling this meeting together, because how many times do we have that opportunity? While this whole initiative started in Washington, D.C., with the president's initiative, came down through the White House committees, it ended up in Oklahoma. But we spread that back out to Indian country. We don't pay, in our cultural ways, we don't pay attention to state borders and jurisdictions. And we're all stronger together. We knew that this impact was going to be on all of our tribes. We just didn't know enough about it. So I just felt like having some tribes who had this level of experience, we have the museums there, it was going to be a teaching opportunity going both ways. What transpired in the meeting, again, was the learning opportunity. One other recognition I need to make is for Dr. Brian Burkhart. He's right here. I needed a venue and someone who was invested and believed in what we were doing. And that was Dr. Burkhart at the University of Oklahoma in the Native Nations Center. They were the first ones to say, we'll give you a space. We'll provide you a space to have this meeting, because it was important to their initiative and what they were trying to accomplish in their department. So if you look at all these people, I was having 4 and 5 different conversations to bring this one day together, one day. All this was happening one day, but we learned a lot. We learned that the museums are open for discussion. We learned that they were ready to talk to the tribes. One of the big concerns that came up was there a policy in place? Because we're so accustomed to that in THPO world. We've worked under the federal government's insight or guidance and regulations on about everything that we do. It was kind of hard for us to grasp the idea that NATHPO rules and regulations wasn't in Berlin, wasn't in New Zealand, wasn't at the University of Oxford or anywhere else, and that we really could talk to them. But some people were asking the State Department's involvement here. You know, we're tribes, so we're used to dealing with federal agencies primarily, but you have to think about it. Now we're talking about international borders. So we needed to have that discussion, and that was Ashley's role, which she gets it as a tribal member, what it means to us as tribes. We didn't gauge anybody's investment into this meeting. We started all at the same level. This was something new, but you have to think about TSA and you have to think about the border. We can't just go into another country and bring in human reins or these, you know, having them searching our bags and handling some sacred items that might not have been handled by anybody other than procurement processes and protecting them. There's a lot of stories out there. We heard a lot of stories about how some of their sacred items were being handled at the Border Patrol. That's why we were also glad to hear about the STOP Act. You know, we know that looting, how do these items get there? Well, some of them were agreed to go on loan to be shown in museums, but not a lot of them. Primarily in this part of the country, we're very familiar with looting. I know when I was a THPO, there was a discussion that we had once upon a time where they even take, I mean, the way that these international countries view who we are as Indigenous people sometimes just blows my mind. You know, we listened to a story where they said they take our bones and they scrape the bones to make a powder and they drink it in a tea in order to embody the spirit of the Native Americans here. That's something we would never even think of, but it's not beyond anyone's thoughts. You know, these auction houses, these museums, they have a lot that belong to us, and they're thinking on how how they got there. After the meeting, I was able to connect another tribe with a New Zealand office to talk about them wanting to bring those remains back to the United States. And they sent me a copy. I didn't ask for it because I'm not over any tribe in that capacity, but they did send me a copy and share with me the story. And it was just a doctor. It was a doctor in Canada, and there was the border right there. Before we seen it as a border, back in the 1800s, moved to New Zealand and took his collection of Indigenous people, their bones with him. You know, so there's a lot of reasons. There's a lot of reports as to why we have this international interest. And I think that this happened because it was supposed to put us all on notice. Is it another duty that we want to add to our list of things to do? It's tough, but we do have ancestors abroad that can come home. And that poses another question. So I started calling the tribes after we had our first initial meeting, which was a learning curve for all of us. Dwayne Hollowhorn Bear was one of our speakers there. And he brought his war shirts that they were able to get back from, I think, Paris University, if I'm not mistaken. And so there are a lot of items over there that's not only human remains, but they're sacred items. Dwayne was able to bring a message that really resonated with the museums that were in attendance. And the feedback from them is that they were really moved, because that was the whole point of bringing our Indigenous voices to the table, is so that they could also hear our perspective and why these matter to us. And they were committed to be ambassadors for us as they went by. I know the University of Oxford said they had 30,000 in their inventory that belongs to some of us. But there are ways to connect with them. And that's going to be the efforts that we're going to start in March. I've been emailing some of them, trying to create a pathway for our tribes to at least get whatever interests in their inventory based on your tribe, your interests, so that we can start having those discussions. I think cost is a matter. Some of the points that were brought up afterwards, when I started calling the tribes back, which I gave them a little bit, this was in November. And I think it was after the holidays in January when I started calling some of the tribes back for feedback. There were a lot of, it was a lot more than I thought. You know, one of them was, what are we going to do with them when we get them here? Where we don't have a repository, we don't have a curation facility at our tribe. Where are we going to bring them from one shelf and put them onto another shelf? That's just a few tribes. So not all the tribes had that same response, but it did come up, and that would be a concern. Another one was probably one of the primary concerns was cost, you know, of traveling to and from another country to bring your ancestors home. Another person said that they didn't have a passport. They've never had a passport, because every one of these museums opened up their doors to the tribes. And they said, if you will come and visit with us, we will show you and we will take you through this process. Not to say that that's the only way to do it. But those are still open discussions that we're having. There's a lot of other discussions that I had with some of the tribes that I'm not at liberty to talk with in an open audience. And that's when I came up with the idea to start having our Zoom sessions in March that is just limited to the tribes, to the tribal THPOs, so that we can start having those discussions and asking those questions. Over a period of time, I do plan on having some of those other museums join us in those Zoom sessions, but as scheduled. There were more that wanted to come, but because they had active repatriations in progress, which I was glad that that's why they weren't here, is because they already had active repatriations moving. We still want to hear from them. And I think that if there's enough tribal interest, this project that I'm working on, I plan on having my report done by September. It could be in the middle of summer, depends on where we are in our discussions. But we want to give something back to the White House Council on Native American Affairs. We want them to have our ideas. It's an open opportunity for the tribes to bring to the table some of these challenges. And just like the Acoma tribe, they didn't give up. They've been doing this since the 1970s. We have a new generation of THPOs. We have a new generation of NACRA representatives that's being trained, and we have young people following in the footsteps of their father, their grandfather, its family. It's time for this new perspective to get a little bit closer, get a tighter grip on what's going on here. And the fact that the United States government extended this invitation to the tribes to have these discussions, I think it's a great opportunity to contribute to that report that I generate in September to get our voice heard. We all know that a lot of these preservation laws, we all know that some of these regulations, they didn't include us. That's why we're stuck going back doing MOUs and MOAs to amend what they passed without our input. Just because our ancestors are abroad, I just don't think that we should. I mean, I know the THPOs have a lot of duties right now, but I think because of all these rules and regulations, that's our challenge. But I honestly think that if we put our heads together, put our ideas together, put our efforts together, that we can work with these international groups. We can contribute to the White House Council on Native American Affairs and tell them where our ideas are and what we would like to see, how we would like to envision it. And I think, again, this is just an opportunity. Don't know if it's ever going to go anywhere, but if it does, then I would like to have my voice heard. And I would like to think that other tribes would like to hear their voices too. So that's my goal. That's my plan, to take all this information that we've garnered from this one meeting, one day meeting. And while there's a lot going on, that's why we've allowed months to be in between. You might not be able to get on this month's Zoom meeting, but then we'll have another one. And I'm always open and available to a call anytime. But if something's going to happen internationally with our ancestors, and we have this open door policy now with these other universities. I know that University of Oxford said that Cambridge was also interested and that they partner up in a lot of their efforts. So the opportunity is there. I think that there's an opportunity for us to propose some things. Bottom line is, I would just like to see our voices attached to anything that can make a change in Indian country. I don't think the majority of our ancestors or our sacred items left by choice. But I just think it was our ancestors knocking on our door with this unique opportunity saying, don't forget about us. We're still here. Come and get us. So that's why I didn't leave a whole lot of statistics, again, because it's left for tribal discussion. But I did want to give you an update on where we are. We're still moving forward with this project. And I would like to invite any tribe that's here that didn't get to participate in that meeting in November to join us in March. I'll be getting email addresses while I'm here till Friday. But if it's something that you're interested in, we would really like to have your voice. And but that's what I have. We have about 15 minutes that we can use for questions. I don't know that I can answer it because we do still have some exclusive responses from some of the tribes. And that's kind of the soft spot where we're in. But I would like to have those discussions with you. I know that the Southern Utes had some challenges there, in the meeting, and I'm so glad you came to be with us. And but we are willing to take some questions right now. Again, we have some of our subcommittee members in the room. So speak now. But thank you. Thank you for listening to me.
Questions? Questions?
I would like, can you rephrase again what your concerns were with your case that you brought up in Oklahoma? I thought that was interesting, and I don't know that you ever got any answers from that meeting. But I would just like you to share with this audience what you shared with us, if you're okay with that.
Yes, I am. Good afternoon, Mike. My name is Cassandra Atencio. I am the THPO and also do NAGPRA with the Southern Ute Indian tribe within the Southern Ute Indian Reservation in Ignacio, Colorado is where our reservation is now. We are one of 2 resident tribes that still maintain, are still placed in within their original part of the original homelands, even though it has shrunk a lot. My biggest thing was I went off. No.
She did.
No, our challenge was the fact of adequate consultation and cultural affiliation, and the fact about the carving out of a park that was a part of the consolidated Southern Ute Reservation prior to this park being designated in 1906. And so it was still reservation lands when Mesa Verde was actually carved out, and Mesa Verde, Nordenskjold had excavated these individuals and took them back. And when consultation started, it was really hard for us at Southern Ute to not be wanting to be involved, but not being recognized as a possible culturally affiliated tribe. We know that there were 2 instances of some, based on the report that we got, of the individuals not coming from within the pueblos, within the dwellings, but kind of up as being unidentified upstreams in a crevice. And so our people did those types of burials. Originally, we did not put our people in the ground. We always placed them in crevices or in rock shelters. And it was the manner within which that non-consultation and non-inclusion within those conversations and not being recognized as part of that conversation and where that place was within that landscape. So that was the biggest hurdle, or the biggest, I guess, gripe against the federal government and that consultation process. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it was a long discussion between the whole group, but very meaningful. I think one of the other questions that came up, and that I would like to get other tribal feedback, was one of the tribes said, if we go over there and bring something back and all the other tribes live in that jurisdiction, who can claim? So you can see some of our challenges in these discussions. It's with those thoughts, and because we have a broad thought on, and there's no policy there, there's no NAGPRA policies there. It's an open door opportunity to go bring your ancestors or your sacred items back, but there's still some of those same questions when you get back to American soil. I think if we're going to propose ideas, we also need to propose challenges and propose solutions. In order to do that, we have to have a really big discussion and some really trained ideas on what we can propose to the United States. Their embassy working with other embassies on our behalf, that's been taking place. So if they're serious about this, in which I truly believe that they are, I just think that it's such an important measure for our tribes to respond on questions such as that, jurisdictional matters, what's going to happen when they get home. Some of the tribes said that they wanted a national cemetery just for us. Why not? You know, we can't take a lot of our ancestors back to where they came from. You know, there's a city there, there's a lake there, there's highways there now. So there's a lot of challenges. It's a big, deep discussion. I'm not going to go any further with tribal comments, but I think that in March, when we start our Zoom sessions, we're open to this level of discussion to really make an impact on, what are the possibilities? What could the challenges be? What could we propose? And that final report, we would send back to the White House Council on Native American Affairs, their subcommittee. We would send that to them, and that would be our native voice in print. But if anybody else, if there's not any more questions, I really don't have anything else to contribute. Okay, well, there's like 3 hands now.
Well, while I'm walking over here, I'm gonna take advantage of having the mic
Okay,
and ask our Department of Defense, we had a person from, or not, Department of Justice?
yeah, DOJ, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm curious what kind of work that justice and state can do to develop repatriation agreements with nations outside the United States, and just think about that while I find the hand. Where was the hand over here? Okay.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Teresa Pascual, and I'm Director for the Pueblo of Acoma's Historic Preservation Office. I want to thank NATHPO and Ms. Bird and our own THPO officer for having this conversation regarding international repatriation. I think it's appropriate now, especially with the passage of the STOP Act, to talk about beyond celebrating the fact that we now have a law on the books that addresses really the gap that has been in place in terms of the failure of the United States to address a law that would cover the illegal trafficking of the cultural patrimony of our tribal nations in the United States, where many other countries have had laws on the books since the 1970s. Part of what Mr. Concho's narrative was touching upon is the fact that the Pueblo of Acoma, as it sought the return of the shield, was faced with a question by the country of France. And that is, does the United States have on the books a law that specifically addresses the illegal trafficking of items of patrimony of tribes? And the United States had to say no. And so therein lied the problem, which then began to get the ball rolling towards what we now know as the STOP Act. But now that it has passed, and I'm glad to see that there's a session tomorrow with folks from the White House to listen to comments provided by this group. There are provisions of the STOP Act, as we noted during the celebration only a few weeks ago, that now we have an opportunity as tribes to get working on. And I'd like to take just a few moments to highlight those for the groups here, because I think those are critical provisions that people need to articulate to the representatives tomorrow, but also note for yourselves in your tribal communities that here are opportunities for you all to participate in. The bill requires that the Department of the Interior and the Department of State each designate a liaison to facilitate and hold trainings and workshops on the voluntary return of human remains and cultural items. Additionally, the Interior must refer individuals and organizations to Indian tribes and Native Hawaiian organizations to facilitate the voluntary return of human remains and cultural items. The Interior must convene an interagency work group and convene a Native working group consisting of representatives of Indian tribes and Native Hawaiian organizations to provide advice on issues concerning the return of and illegal trade in human remains and cultural items. Those specific provisions which are called out in the act itself are all places of opportunity for each one of you to participate in. Part of what our office has done is try to underscore back to the Interior Department and Department of Justice, as well as our own congressional representatives, that it's also going to take funding to carry out these provisions, funding to support our own tribal organizations to participate in those things. That's where I think NATHPO as a whole can lend its voice to and support for ensuring that there's adequate funding so that those provisions can get carried out. Thank you.
We had another hand over here, I think.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Raylan Williams. I'm the Cultural Resource Specialist for the Gila River Indian Community Tribal Historic Preservation Office. And we had a similar meeting in Arizona
Yes, yeah.
right after ATOM. And there was also a session on it at ATOM, which there I don't think provided enough time for a lot of Q&A because of the short session time. And a similar situation in Arizona, we didn't have enough time to really get the information out and where to have it at. And I don't think it was heavily attended by the tribes in Arizona just because of the short time in planning it. But Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian Community was the host of that meeting. And it was a really good discussion between us and the people present and the museums. And we did share a lot of our concerns, which, you know, is one of them was actually trying to find out what is there, what's in their inventory, you know, because we don't know. And how are we going to access that inventory, you know, and how do we know which museums there are willing to share that information or are willing to take that step to conduct repatriation and consultation. And but we're glad, you know, that just those 3 museums did show up and did express their interest in working with the tribes to conduct repatriation. And I've had some time to reflect on that meeting, and one thing that popped into my head was what kind of resources is the State Department and going to provide to the tribes. You know, I feel that one would be the escorting of our cultural objects back home. What kind of security are we going to get? You know, because even doing NAGPRA repatriation here in the States, we still are up against security issues. Yes, you know, and that is a very much concern for the 4 O'odham tribes of Arizona, because we experience it all the time. And the other is you know, funding, of course. It would be, we would have to do a lot of convincing to our own tribal council to get that much, to get the amount of money we need to travel and also to obtain passports.
Yes.
You know, and another for me would be, what if there's a language barrier? You know, if there's someone in this international museums who don't speak English very well, you know, who's gonna help assist us in translation, you know, in translating what the cultural aspects of taking care of and handling the cultural objects. But that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. I know that I would like to meet with you guys on your meeting, you know, if you guys want to join in on the Zoom sessions that I'm going to continue to hold. I don't know if you've submitted a report yet or anything like that, but I think that we could put our minds together and team up and see what we can come up. But those are very legitimate concerns and some that has been echoed with some of the tribes that I've been able to follow up with. The escorting, security issues, the State Department over the passports. You know, I think that would be something that we could talk to them about as well. But I think Ashley had her hand up too.
I wanted to answer your question about agreements between the United States and other countries. So there are cultural property agreements that the US does have with foreign countries, but those are all source countries. So it's like Iraq and Afghanistan, where there's active looting and trafficking going on from those countries. And then we're seeing them come into the US. We don't have any of those cultural property agreements where the US is considered the source country. I think that this is something very new to the State Department to think of the US in that way. And these cultural property agreements may not be the best vehicle for working with foreign countries, especially since a lot of the collections have been in those countries for quite a long time. So we're talking about different ways that we can work country to country on some sort of agreement on bringing especially ancestors and funerary items home. And I don't want to speak for the Department of Justice since Martin is here, but justice really gets involved when there's been an illegal taking. And so a lot of what I work on is the diplomatic aspect and making those connections with foreign institutions. I will say it's a lot easier for us to make those connections with state-run institutions. The private institutions are more difficult. But I wanted to flag one of the things we also heard in our 2-week extravaganza was a desire for sort of a reverse exchange. So for tribal representatives, tribal elders to go abroad and visit, especially they're mostly located in Western Europe, but these institutions that have collections of Native American ancestors and items. So the State Department does have funding to send tribal representatives overseas. And so if you're a tribe or you have a connection already with an international institution and would like to travel abroad to learn more about the collection, to have these discussions around repatriation or just other forms of engagement, we are working on that program right now. If you don't have those connections with international institutions, and I know one of the big questions we hear is what's out there. So if you don't already have those connections, but would like to make those connections, we can assist if necessary. So I just wanted to give a plug for that. So
Thank you. Other questions? Any of y'all watch John Oliver? You watch John Oliver? So I'll make my way back here. I found it fascinating that he did a piece on looting of antiquities and the process or lack thereof for preventing looting and trafficking in antiquities. And I was shouting at my TV, have you heard of NAGPRA? And I want John Oliver to do a piece on how poorly the United States has done on its own obligations. But I also find it interesting that up until maybe now, the United States has cared more about trafficking in antiquities from elsewhere than they have cared about the trafficking of ancestors from this country. So hopefully now is the time that that's changing. Where was the hand?
That was the payback.
Hey, Miranda Panther, NAGPR officer for the Eastern Band. Sheila, I just had a question. If you would be able to send a draft copy of the report out to the tribes?
Yeah, whenever we get through having our meetings, getting everybody's feedback. Before we send it to anybody, of course, it would be available to THPO offices.
Okay, thank
So,
you.
Okay, anybody else? Seeing no hands, I want to thank our speakers, Sheila, Mr. Concho, for speaking with us this afternoon. Thank you. Let's give them a round of applause. Excellent work. And I think you're going to hear from a lot of us to get on board with you. So at this point, we are done for the afternoon. I want to remind you that we have our business dinner for members and for prospective members